Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you back. My apologies, lunch break got a little cramped, but as people filter back in, we will try to stay on schedule somewhat with our next presentation. Our next presenter is Pastor Joe Cox. He is a teacher at Lutheran South in St. Louis, teaching literature and theology, as well as spending about half of his time doing administration and curriculum planning. And Joe went to the Academy of Apologetics in Strasbourg, France in 2017 and had planned to go back a little sooner, but then there were a couple of years that were canceled due to COVID and ended up going back in 2022 when I was there as well with my son Matthew. And at that point he sat for the written and oral exams for the Academy and became a fellow of the Academy. And Joe's passion is in literature and in film and how they tie Christians into culture. Fun story. We took a trip into Germany for the weekend to visit one of his former students, and on the way back, the map took us on a rather odd route, and we went through the town of Frankenstein, Germany. I didn't realize Pastor Cox is a huge fan of Frankenstein. So we pulled over, we found where the castle is. Pastor Cox and Matthew hiked up, explored Frankenstein's castle in Germany, totally unexpected, and Joe might have said was one of the highlights of his professional career. So Joe is a great person to talk on this bridge between our Christian life and culture through literature. So please welcome Pastor Joe Cox.
Thank you, sir. True confession, I hiked, Matthew ran up the mountain to the Frankenstein castle. And halfway here I thought, oh, I have that stone piece of the castle that had fallen off that I brought. And I should have brought it with me today, and I forgot to do that. So I like to pick up a couple of historical artifacts. In fact, it's a great segue. Does anybody know what this is a picture of? Has anybody seen this before, or maybe experienced it? You don't get to answer. This is called the Long Room. I'll let you figure out why. And it is at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. Oh, you've been there. Okay.
Is that where the Book of Kells is from?
Well, so here's the story. A long time ago, about 2021, my wife and I had discovered this travel company. This is not an advertisement, but we managed to take some trips on fairly reasonable. So my mother is like second generation Irish American, and she's always wanted to go to Ireland. So we came up with this. We're not sure how much longer she's going to be with us. She's not entirely mobile, so we planned a trip to take her to Ireland. So she went with us and our daughter, and we got to go to the Long Room. And before you get to the Long Room, which is this beautiful, it's just stacked with books, and you've got the statues of people in history. But first, you start down at a lower level. And as we entered the lower level, and you go through, and there's a little museum, and you enter into a dark room. And in the middle of that room is a podium of sorts with a glass case. And inside that glass case, under that proper ultraviolet light in order to protect it, is the oldest book ever discovered in Ireland. It goes all the way back to the 9th century, containing copies of the gospel. Now, of course, standing in that room next to the podium with the glass encased and I'm sure alarmed systemed Book of Kells was a security guard to make sure you come in and you take your quick little glance at the Book of Kells, and then you move quietly on your way up to the Long Room. Well, this is where we discovered that inviting my mother to come with us on these journeys actually has an added benefit. Not being entirely mobile, she just really wasn't going to do the stairs. And my wife, who is ever the caretaker, grabs her and takes her to the security guard and says, she really can't get up these stairs. Is there another way? The security guard goes, yeah, actually, we have an elevator right here that we use for other purposes, but I'll be happy to let you use it. And so he took my mother and my wife over to the elevator. Well, as he did this and left his post, my daughter, who has a heart like her father, there's nobody watching the Book of Kells. I said, I gotcha. So a little bit of contraband here. Anybody interested in seeing the Book of Kells? A quickly snatched photo of the Book of Kells. I promised the flash was off. Security guard did not catch us. Usually my photography is a little bit better than that, but as you can imagine, I was going really quickly. But that awe, being in the presence of something that's so old, being in the presence of something that has been handed down, particularly the fact that it contains the very narrative and story of our Lord Jesus Christ, was a really neat experience. I love being able to dabble into those kind of things. So, well, what are we doing here? Talk about literary apologetics, or using literature with apologetics to engage the culture. And this is kind of a complete, if not a 180, at least a 90-degree turn from how we oftentimes talk about apologetics. What I did is I tried to create a bit of a chart, and I actually borrowed this chart from a book called Apologetics at the Cross, and looking at the fact that there are different approaches to apologetics. And generally speaking, you have what's referred to as the classical or evidential approaches. And when you're in these areas, there tends to be more of an interest in the head stuff. I will confess, I fall really hard into the head stuff. I like the evidence stuff. One of the things I do at Lutheran South is I coach the mock trial team. And students know when they come into my room, if they make a proposition, they're going to be challenged to provide evidence for it. Well, over here on the other side, though, is recognizing that to some degree, some people aren't necessarily motivated quite as much by the head stuff. Some people are motivated more by the heart. And it's really easy, at least speaking for myself as more of a head person, to look at the heart people and go, really? But then, a little bit of maybe a nudging of the Holy Spirit smacking me in the back of the head is a reminder that we have all been created differently, uniquely, and beautifully by God. And so it's a real danger to look at how someone else approaches the gospel, or how the Holy Spirit works in someone else's heart, and think, well, that's not the way I get there, and immediately discount it. I think there's a lot of advantages. So classical, just to give you a sense here, these are literally the philosophical arguments for God. The concept that there is no God, what's called infinite regression. You know, how did the universe get here? Well, God created it. Well, where did God come from? Well, you have one of two options. Either a previous God who created him, or he's eternal. The problem is, what happens if you go the route of a previous God that created him? Well, how did he get there? And so the classical argument was, well, there is this uncreated thing, this uncreated creator, who is God. And classical apologetics will take those philosophical arguments. Evidential apologetics looks at the evidence we have and recognizes that the gospel is a piece of history. I'll talk a little about that in a little bit. But because of that, it leaves its imprint. The life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ has left an imprint in the records of the eyewitnesses, in archaeology. And so we have these pieces of evidence that strengthen the claims of Christianity. Now keep in mind that one is not going to be convinced into faith either by philosophical arguments or by all of the evidence in the world falling on their heads. Ultimately, there is a point where the Holy Spirit is at work through his word that creates faith in the heart of people. But you've also got on the other side kind of the heart-motivated people. Presuppositionalists might claim, it's really no use arguing, you just got to proclaim. It's an unfair simplification of presuppositional apologetics. But then we get into this experiential or narratival apologetics, recognizing that people are touched by experiences and people are touched by the power of story. And that becomes an inroads into which we can start to talk about the Christian faith. And we look for openings to be able to share who Jesus is as people have their experiences. So here we are, in 3/4 of the way through an apologetics workshop, and I'm asking the question, what is apologetics? And that is not in any way to be dismissive of the other presenters. As I was preparing for this workshop, this is something that I've been kind of pondering, and one of the things I've been really trying to wrestle with, and I made the point that for the gospel of Jesus Christ to be an historical event, meaning it actually happened. God really took on human flesh, and the disciples could really see and touch him. And when he died, he really died. And when he rose, that tomb was really empty. And it happened in history. I'm going to go one step further. We have been tricked into our culture of thinking as history as either secular or sacred. We've been tricked into thinking of the Bible as, well, yeah, it's true, but fill in your little blank. But what if we start thinking about history in a completely different way? The reality is, despite what some of my students think, I wasn't around at the time of the American Revolution. And yet I accept, by faith, that the colonists won the war for independence. I accept, by faith, that George Washington was the first president. But wait, someone says, we have evidence for that. Yeah, guess what? We have evidence for a lot of it. And not just our secular history. But rather, what we should do is keep in mind that the gospel of Jesus Christ is simply history. And when we think about things that way, that history is going to have an impact. It's going to leave an imprint. Why is it that we know that the colonists won the war? Well, I mean, yeah, look around. Right? Why is it that we accept that George Washington was the first president? We learn in school. All the eyewitnesses kind of testified. All the evidence points it there. How do I know they're not all lying? Yeah, you know what that jump is called? Faith. And we practice faith with everything. Because life really has uncertainties built in. And so it's no more surprise that we have the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the implications of what happens when God dies for mankind and returns to life to demonstrate that that sacrifice was acceptable. And so I have the evidences, and the Holy Spirit creates in me faith that trusts that that evidence is true and that my salvation is secure in Jesus Christ. Well, so I'm going to say this. Apologetics is the defense of reality. And by saying that, I'm not trying to leave the gospel of Jesus Christ out. But what I'm suggesting is all of reality, all of human history is quite simply bound up in the resurrection. All that it means to be human is found in the Garden of Eden, where humanity is created in the image of God and falls and needs to be restored. And oh, by the way, God takes care of that too. And he promises that one day his Son will come back, where we will enter into that paradise once again. That is human history. And so when we're talking about apologetics, it's not merely a defense of the gospel, it's a defense of reality itself. And this is where we start working forward, because this defense of reality has implications. Now, a couple other real quick definitions. What is literature? And so I define literature by giving you a completely different vocabulary word. This is something that I probably shouldn't have done. But we use this word text, or at least I'm going to use it, and so I want to share it with you because it just slips out sometimes. I have a coworker who really hates the word, so it seems to slip out a lot more since I learned that. But we have this text. What is it? Well, it doesn't have to be a text message. It doesn't even have to be a written text in a book. It can be music. It can be a movie. But in some way, what we have is a way of communicating. Either expositionally, meaning making propositions, claiming that things are true, or through imagination, through telling stories. By somehow getting bound up, not necessarily in a truth claim, but in the very experience that carries me along as I journey in a story with someone. Well, I want to go a little bit deeper. What is literature? Literature can be used a lot of different ways. The reality is, I had a class in college that was called What is Literature? And I think the only way to get an A on the final exam was to write down, we don't know. I did not go to a Christian university. There was a lot of I don't knows there. But I'm going to suggest to you that literature, specifically I'm talking about imaginative literature, I'm talking about fiction in particular, is a way in which we explore the human condition. We make up stories, and behind those made up stories are glimpses of reality. And those glimpses of reality can become for us touch points where we can start having deeper conversations with people who maybe are a little bit hesitant about hearing about this Jesus person. But they'd be more than willing to sit down over a cup of coffee and discuss the latest Marvel movie. And suddenly, we have a way that we can talk that opens up that possibility to share the gospel. So a couple of things I wanted to do is think about how media works, how texts work. Because this has changed over the years, and it changes how we approach things. And so what I have here across, you got theater. See if this really works. I got a pointer because I'm too short to reach any of this. Yeah, that's not working. All right. Theater, and I'm talking ancient Greek type theater. I'm talking Shakespeare type theater. That was pretty much the original way of communicating stories. It was the way in which culture itself was taught. Not necessarily through a list of do's and don'ts, but rather through telling stories about what happens when you do or when you fail not to. How many of us learned do not lie because we were told, don't lie? Maybe confirmation class, thou shalt not bear false witness. Or was it before then, when you heard the story of the little boy, Pinocchio, yeah. I said the little boy who cried wolf. And that story has a power that resonates with us. Well, it starts in the theater. Then when you get to the printing press, and especially by the 1800s, and you have the invention of the novel or the modern novel, it suddenly becomes individualized. And we're no longer in a group of people. It's not the whole community coming together to experience the story. We start experiencing on our own. But now, because of electronic media, things have changed. We still have that individual experience, but we're back to also experiencing things in community, kind of, sort of, although COVID kind of messed up movie theaters. And so now what are we doing? We're all experiencing the same story as people across the world in our own little couches and sofas and reclining chairs. We have, on one level, the same story that everyone's encountering, but we're doing it by ourselves. A couple other things happen. When I'm watching theater, I'm a distant observer. I'm in the back, it's one way, it's kind of like you looking at me. You can choose if you want to look over here or look at the screen, but you're kind of stuck. But when I'm reading, I have a chance to stop and think that the visions that I picture in my brain while I'm reading the same book that you are may be totally different. But I become enmeshed in the story and has power. Now, digital media, again, video, has, to some degree, the best of both worlds. Not necessarily that it lets you stop, But unlike theater, where you have basically one camera angle, very early on in the history of Hollywood, what people discovered was, you know what you can do? You can take that camera and you can actually move the viewer right into the actual experience. And you can choose how that viewer connects with the story and what that viewer feels. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are really smart people who are making this stuff up, and they know they have that power. And they do it on purpose. And they get paid to do it. They're called advertisers. And which is always kind of funny when the Hollywood people say, oh, no, our movies don't shape culture. Really? Because you make a lot of money convincing other people that they do, so they put commercials out there. So it's just kind of a way of thinking about how media works differently. So how does this all come together? Well, as I'm trying to think about literary apologetics, this is the definition I came up with, is the use of literature, remember by this I mean narrative, the use of stories to prompt and enable discussions about the human condition. Once again, notice I am using a definition for apologetics that very dangerously leaves out the word the gospel, leaves out the name Jesus Christ. I'm not doing that to be dismissive of Jesus or his salvific work, but to recognize that our stories that we engage with and we talk about with our friends and our family don't necessarily point directly to Jesus Christ. They don't necessarily point to the biblical narrative of history, but they touch on the very things that are bound up and enmeshed in history. That human condition, what it means to be mortal, what it means to love, what it means to have a heart broken, what it means to have a child. And that as we start to allow these stories to carry us along and experience vicariously life through the lives of the characters with whom we interact, we now get touch points that we can say, you know, that deep longing that this person is looking for in pick your favorite novel actually says something deep about what it means to be human. And oh, by the way, there's an answer for that longing. I'd love to tell you about it. So this is what we're doing with literary apologetics. We're using literature as a means of connecting people. One quick last little definition. C.S. Lewis talked about the baptized imagination. He referred to George MacDonald, who was a kind of a fantasy writer who inspired him. And I think in order to get to the discussion, we first have to do this. So the baptized imagination is that use of art and literature to consider the transcendent realities of the human condition. That means before I'm able to talk with someone and said, oh, by the way, you're reading this redemption story. A Tale of Two Cities. I'm going to go really classical here. And you have the sense of this character, Sidney Carton, who recognizes that he has an amazing opportunity. So spoiler alert if you haven't read the book. Best thing that could possibly happen for him. The husband of the woman he loves is about to die by guillotine in the French Revolution. You think that's good news for him, right? And as he walks the streets of Paris the night before the execution, it's the words of John's gospel that rumble through his head. I am the resurrection and the life. Well, Sidney Carton happened to look a lot like his love's husband. And so he manages to sneak into the prison and replaces her husband. And the book ends with his beheading, knowing that he has rescued the husband. And it concludes with the words, it's a far better thing I've ever done than I'll ever do, and a far better place to which I'll go than I've ever been. It has nothing to do with Jesus. Maybe. But as I get swept along in that story, and I recognize the sacrifice that he was willing to make, true love that was willing to sacrifice his opportunity once her husband was quote unquote out of the way. And I can have a discussion and say, by the way, let's talk about what true love really looks like. And there's a natural shift in a conversation that organically can move toward the proclamation of the gospel. But this baptized imagination recognizes that I, as a Christian, have to be aware of that very drive of the human condition. I have to understand human history. I have to understand God's perspective and how he reveals himself to us, and be able to see that the experiences of these characters really mirror what's going on in our own lives. So one of the ways I try to do this, and I've been working on this with our faculty in the English department, is I want to be very intentional about the fact that when I approach a piece of literature or a text, whether it's a movie or whatever, I want to be very aware that not every author is out there trying to write some sort of Jesus story. I'm still torn on Charles Dickens. I'm not sure how Christian he was. I'm going to hedge the bets in favor that I will have an opportunity to meet him in paradise. But the jury can be still out based on the scholars. I want to take his text and I want to not do damage to it. The reality is, being from the Missouri side, we do have this author that we're tending to be proud of, a guy by the name of Mark Twain. May or may not be aware he wasn't the most fond person of Christianity. And yet, I still can't get over the fact that Tom Sawyer was dead for 3 days. And they even had his funeral. And then he showed up again afterwards. Now, on one hand, I need to be really careful because I'm not sure that Mark Twain was really trying to make some sort of Jesus claim there, and I need to treat the text seriously for what it says and not do damage to it. But I can recognize that hidden in that becomes this level too. I can start seeing things that are touch points. In the case of the Tom Sawyer story, Aunt Polly, who has now lost the boy who's pretty much her son and is devastated. And the reality thing is, if you remember Tom Sawyer, I think Aunt Polly would just as soon give the boy a swat as a hug. Well, if you're my kid, I think so too. And yet when you're in that place, and she actually says it, it doesn't matter if I could only have him back, which is what motivates him. He's like, oh, hey, guess what, Aunt Polly? I could have a touch point to talk about those experiences and start opening up the gateway. Down the street from Concordia Seminary, we've got Dr. Bars at Covenant Seminary who's produced this book, Echoes of Eden. And one of the things he suggests is that all stories basically are echoes of the biblical story he puts in the context of Eden. That all stories either focus on Eden in its original glory, paradise, or the hope for paradise, followed by the lost paradise, which I think is what most of our stories are about, and then ultimately the hope of a new paradise, the hope of being restored. And some stories follow this. All of these, some stories just focus on some of these. For example, any Shawshank Redemption fans in here? Okay, what keeps Andy alive? Hope. And he is suffering through that entire movie with his lost paradise. The loss of his wife, the realization of why his wife is lost, the fact that he has been unjustly imprisoned for her death, and he's suffering in that moment, and yet the hope of freedom is what comes, which keeps him going. Again, other than the fact that the key to salvation was found in the Bible, there really isn't necessarily a direct connection. It's not necessarily supposed to be a metaphor for Jesus. But if you've ever been falsely accused, not even by the legal system, maybe by a friend, if you've ever suffered for the crime that someone else committed or the sin that someone else committed, if you've ever had hope to find yourself out of the prison of whatever shape you've been in, you can identify with Andy. And the movie is poignant with that. Once again, I'm sitting with a cup of coffee and I can talk about that experience. And I can move it from the movie to my own life, to the hope I have that carries me out. Literary apologetics. So this next slide, a little bit of, I think we like to call it the trigger warning. Who are my people in here like, oh great, narratives, like this is like English class, right? Please don't do this to me ever again. Be honest. Nobody? Okay, I got at least one. Thank you for your, yeah, this is the thing. I'm gonna test your English knowledge and maybe give somebody some traumatic feedback here. Oh, helps if I point the right way. All right, anybody ever seen a plot line before? Storyline? The Freitag storyline. Anybody starting to already have tremors a little bit? I hated this thing. Anybody remember what comes first? This is the audience participation part of. Maybe this will sound a little familiar. Yeah, I keep pointing. I have a smart board at school, so I'm used to pointing this way. Exposition, the introduction, the setting, the characters, what's going on. Yeah, okay. How about this one? The initial conflict. Whatever starts the story going. And then, of course, the action rises up until finally it comes to the climax. The surprising twist where things seem so uncertain and so impossible to get out of, and hope breaks through. And then, of course, it begins to roll back down to the final resolution, which ends up in our nice French word. I don't know why this is the one word that never got translated. The dénouement. The wrapping up, the riding off into the sunset. I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for you kids and that stupid dog, or however they say it in Scooby-Doo. Well, the funny thing is, this thing has this structure of story is something that goes across all stories. And this is why I'm suggesting we can use narrative as a means to connect, because I think there's another way of seeing how narrative actually works. So for example, let's take the echoes of Eden in what I'm going to call his story. The exposition is in paradise. The initial conflict is when the fall happens. The rising action is God continuing to work with his people, Israel, and then finally culminates in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and his resurrection, at which point you have the new Israel who goes forth to proclaim this. And oh, by the way, have you noticed it's not just a story in the Bible, but we're still living it, because we're still living in the hope of his return, when the resurrection is something that is not just true of him, but is something that will be true of me. And man, do I yearn for that more these days than ever, as the back starts to hurt a little bit more. And it'll be true of my grandfather, whom I haven't seen in 20 years, and look forward to being reunited with him. And oh yeah, that denouement, when the new heavens and the new earth are inaugurated. This is reality. This is history. And guess what? The story of history has the same exact structure as every other story we tell. And this is not something new. Those of you who learned this back in elementary school or middle school or wherever, this guy, Gustav Freitag, and it's been played with a little bit, he was actually basically basing it off something else. You see up at the top here, I've got Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, Act 5. Hey, guess what? It was the structure of theater. Remember how everything came from theater? Okay, turns out that all those Shakespearean plays have 5 acts. And guess what all the acts do? They trace the same exact points. You want to go back farther? People who were working with narrative, there was this really old guy who used to walk around in his robes all the time. His name was Aristotle. He wrote a book going, I wonder how stories work. Now, I like to make fun of him because in English, his answer is, all stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Yeah, this is the great philosopher Aristotle. Unfortunately, I don't think the fault's on him. I think it's a bad translation of his Greek. But for example, it ends in catastrophe. That sounds horrible. Except when he talks about catastrophe, he's talking about the wrapping up. He's talking about the conclusion. We tend to think of it as something negative. All right. So with that, what's happening? I'm taking this from Dr. Rossau, who was a professor at the seminary way back in the day. And he talks about this on 2 levels. I'm talking about the fact that stories reflect reality. He's talking about the fact that the gospel event has spilled out of the Bible. It is such a powerful story that resonates with us so deeply that it spills out into the stories that we tell. And it has glimmers of it. And once again, when we're aware of that, and we have the opportunity to have these conversations, it's a chance to share the gospel in a way that's non-threatening. It's a way to sit, and maybe you have a grandchild. I talking about the Marvel movies. I'm not saying they're the most religious movies of any kind. But you've got a grandchild who's just excited as all get out to talk about this last movie that he saw, and you can listen to him for a while, and then you can ask some questions about some of the angst that some of the characters are experiencing, and then make the transition to, have you felt that way? How have you experienced that? Hey, by the way, you know that there's something greater? There's a hero that is slightly less disreputable than Iron Man? Or slightly more innocent than Spider-Man? Let me tell you about Jesus. And these become ways that we can have these kind of conversations. So here's my grand irony, and here's what I'm going to put forth here, is that when I'm talking about fiction, which we usually think of as not true stories, that the joy of the not true stories is they actually reveal truth. And when I say they reveal truth, I don't mean that they reveal truth because the characters or the events and the settings are necessarily real. Every once in a while, I have to break it to a diehard believer and tell him that Frodo really isn't an actual being and Mordor doesn't exist. Sorry, it happened again. And yet, the struggle of good over evil, the struggle of being the smallest guy on the block who's the only one to stand up and do something right, and then in the darkest moments when you feel all is gone and all you can look is to a distant light and a memory of Jesus, and think about the evil that he faced on that darkest of days and find hope, there's a reality that comes out of that. And so we can use fiction as a means to point to truth. So let me give you a couple quick examples. Anybody seen The Martian or read the book? Okay? Think about, again, don't know this is a very religious story, right? I mean, it's a guy who's stranded on Mars. It's not as far-fetched as it once was, which is really mind-blowing too. But I want you to think about what he's facing. Wait, he's alone? He's only going to eat literally by the sweat of his brow. He needs someone from the outside to come and rescue him. Where have I heard that story before? Yeah, walking around the desert. Faith, you mentioned that sense of loneliness that we're struggling with. It doesn't get much more lonely than being on Mars without means of communication. Well, again, I'm not going to try to make the story be about Jesus. The story is what it is. But when I talk about the experience I received through that story, now I can start having an opportunity to share my faith. Or let's get old. Who are my musical people in here? Literally musicals. Okay? Abigail's excited. Les Mis, right? Again, I was doing some research, Victor Hugo, going back to the novel before the musical. As best as I can tell, by the time Victor Hugo writes this, he doesn't have much use for Christianity. And definitely by the end of his life, he's done. And yet here's a story about a man who was originally convicted for stealing some bread so, some people could eat. And his entire life is swept away, and he finally gets out of prison. He has nothing left to do, but he resorts to hatred and a despicable act, and he is caught in it. And when his accuser comes forward as he is in the clutches of the police, the accuser forgives him. None of this, oh, it's all right kind of stuff. But rather, oh, by the way, you forgot to take this extra gold, as the blood from the attack is still trickling from his head. Wow. Where have I seen that kind of grace before? And what does that grace do? Well, it transforms him. Okay? Frankenstein. here you have a story, once again, I've seen some people who argue, oh, Mary Shelley was a faithful Christian. I like the eyes. Yeah. There's other things that I've read about her and her husband and their family, and that makes me give pause to that. But as she writes this story, number one, a story about a man who so desires to conquer death that he goes out and he robs graves and takes pieces of bodies and reconfigures them to bring this creature to life, and then rejects it. Wow. It becomes a story about what happens when man tries to play God and takes the power of life into his own hands. Once again, I know I've read that story somewhere. And oh, by the way, you know what happens when man does that? It doesn't turn out well. Or, again, I can go back to my what is literature class in college. The feminist reading of that book. Mary Shelley had already lost at least 2 children. And the entire story, the women are the ones who aren't involved in life. It's the men taking the place of the women. And we can look at it, well, but what about when I'm interacting with somebody who's had that very experience? And I now have a chance to be able to talk about that experience and that desperate sense of the women in the story. Or if I want to talk about somebody who feels so lonely and can't connect like the creature, who ultimately just wants to be connected and tracks down Frankenstein to request, make a bride for me. And I'm not talking like the 1940s and 50s monster movies. And the creator goes, no, be lonely. And it destroys this creature. It's not good for man to be alone. And I have a place to talk and share and consider the deep questions of life as they're revealed in fiction. Or, a little bit more up to date, I am a bit of a superhero nerd. Smallville, the stories of Superman before he was Superman. What does that look like to you if you look real carefully? Season 1, Clark Kent, who is just discovering his powers, is incapacitated, and the school bullies take him out in a field and tie him up as a scarecrow on a cross. And if that's not enough for you, the next day, Lex Luthor, who at that point is his friend and discovered him, says, even the Romans saved that for a special occasion. I wonder what connection's trying to be made. If you're not sure, you can listen to the theme song, Somebody Save Me. And so we have these things. Well, so what's happening here? I want you to keep in mind, Andy Weir, the guy who created The Martian, he's an agnostic. I mentioned Victor Hugo, by the end of his life, is a deist. Mary Shelley, not sure, but doubtful. The guys who created Superman, Joe Shuster, Jerry Siegel, they were Jewish. These aren't Christian-oriented stories, but they're digging at the reality of faith. They're digging at the reality of the human condition. And because of that, we have a place where we can resonate and we can start talking about our Christian faith. I got one more here, I think. Oh, yeah, this is the beauty. So the beauty of being able to go a little bit later in a conference is as people are talking, you can have more ideas and add to your presentations. So last week I was at the Museum of the Bible, and they actually have an exhibit about the use of the Bible in literature. So there's all of their beautiful exhibit from the top with the books hanging down. I promise it looks a lot cooler in person than on the picture. But with that, there we go. I want to give a warning. Anybody ever seen the movie Matrix? It's a little bit older, but okay. Man, if you want Christian stuff, yeah, be careful. There's a whole lot of Christian language in here. It's not a Christian movie. It's a Gnostic movie. It's based on an ancient heresy. We have to be intentional about what we're doing, but we have to recognize the powers of the stories because the powers will have resonance. Night by Elie Wiesel. Story about his experiences in the concentration camp. Elie Wiesel loses his faith in God, his Jewish faith in God, through his experiences here. Probably not very shocking when we consider it. It's a difficult book to read. But the preface When he comes out of the concentration camp, and about 10 years later, he's attempting to sell his story so that the story can be told, so it would never be repeated. Nobody wants to touch it. In fact, his concern is people need to know, and the Jewish community says, we don't want our children to have to experience what we experienced. He finally finds a publisher in France by the name of Marillac. And Marillac describes one of the key scenes in the book, which is a hanging of a young child. And in a book, this is where he comes to that rejection of God, and somebody asks, well, this child's being hung, where is God? And his response is, there he is, hanging there. And Marillac is reflecting on this, and he says, as I came across that, and he described that story to me, here's what I wanted to say. I wanted to tell him about a fellow Jew of his who was willing to hang there for all of us. And I wanted to tell him about the hope that we have because of that. And he finally concludes, but all I could do was cry and embrace him. Once again, it was not meant to be a Christian symbol. But in those tragedies, reality has a way of emerging, and it's exactly what happens. And it's impossible from a baptized imagination to read that story and not see the correlation. And then maybe have the opportunity to share that correlation with others who are reading the story but don't know who Jesus is. So, one of the things to remember is the difference between expository. So Dr. Clayton gets up and he tells you all about the different artifacts and what's been discovered, and he's sharing with you the truths. And imagine if literature was just tell stories. The reality is, facts are easier to teach. But narrative leaves a greater impact. And that's why we look at this, because it's a way of sneaking in. There was a guy who talked about this, and again, here's another slide just for you, because I would hate for anybody to feel all alone. At the Museum of the Bible in the Literature Department, there is, as an artifact, the original edition of C.S. Lewis's Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, complete with another nerd who also takes pictures of the... so we have that. So what does Lewis do for us? Lewis, in one of his articles, talks about sneaking past watchful dragons. People are on guard for the stuff they don't want to hear. People are on guard for the things they don't want to believe, and their guard is up. Well, what do? Narrative gives us a way to slip in. And here's the secret. It's been happening, and it's been happening to us. About 5 years ago, up to about 4 or 5 years ago, when I get to a certain part in one of my classes and I ask students, what do you think the population of people who claim to be gay in the United States is? Any thoughts? Just out of curiosity. How much? 1.5, I'm hearing 3. 0.5%. Okay. I mean this lovingly. You're all abnormal here. I'm not saying you're off. Usually when I ask this question, I get 25%. 50%, and then I say, Google it, you have those Chromebooks. 5 years ago, it was 3.5 according to the national census. It's now up to over 7% in just a few years. And mostly, again, it's a growth among our younger people. Why? Because it's in all their stories. What's so surprising about thinking you're getting numbers like 25 or 50% when 25 or 50% of the characters in all the TV shows and the movies that they're watching are portrayed that way? And they don't stop to think, actually, I don't really have that many gay friends. The power of narrative is snuck in. And we've let it happen. We're watchful if our child had brought in something that was maybe in favor of homosexuality and why this is the best option for a Christian, or why what Scripture has to say about human sexuality isn't important anymore. We say, you know what, we need to talk about this, and maybe this isn't really what we need to be doing. But they get it in their music, they get it in the stories, they get it in the TV shows, and they sneak past us watchful dragons. What if we go the other way? We recognize there are watchful dragons. We're going to take those narratives and we're going to recognize we can sneak past too. And we can sneak past with a much more noble and upfront purpose to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. Lewis talks about this too. He's got a short essay called On Fairy Stories, in which he's defending why he used fairy tales. And finally he gets to that point that what happens is when you're telling a story, especially a story with the staying power of the gospel, he kind of concludes it this way. It's not difficult to imagine the peculiar excitement and joy that one would feel if any especially beautiful fairy story were to be found primarily true. Its narrative to be history, without thereby necessarily losing the mythical or allegorical significance it possessed. How cool would it be to find out there really is a galaxy that was a long, far, no, I tried that, messed that all up. How cool would it be to know there was a galaxy a long time ago, far, far away? That'd be kind of fun. Well, but he says this, it's not difficult for one would be called upon to try and conceive anything of a quality that was unknown. The joy would have exactly the same quality, to discover that the truth of something like Star Wars or superheroes actually points to reality. Well, he calls this the eucatastrophe, the Christian joy, the gloria, the high and joyous, the discovery that there is truth in our fiction, and that truth points to a reality that is greater than we can imagine. Remember, I was making fun of Aristotle's end, the catastrophe? Notice what Tolkien calls it, the eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe, the surprise of the resurrection, and the hope we have of a resurrection that's coming. A hope that pulls into it all of the human condition that's been expressed in any of our stories. And recognizing that, we have a chance to have those conversations. We'll do it in different ways. It may be in a book club. It might be alone online. It might be in a movie theater. And the reality is the discussions will be different. You'll be sitting around with a group of Christians and your faith will be emboldened as you share together that baptized imagination. Or maybe you're talking to somebody who isn't a Christian and it becomes more of an apologetic rather than a faith strengthener. Ultimately, it drives us back to discussing who Jesus is. There is a power in story. The Word became flesh. Now, you may not remember the exact points on a plot line, but you remember my story about my mom in the Book of Kells? There's power in story. It carries us through. It connects us in ways that simply proclaiming truth sometimes misses. And in that, we have a way to touch those, to be vessels of spirits, of the Holy Spirit, to touch those who maybe they're struggling, but are just as loved, and for whom Christ also died. So I know I'm pushing time. I apologize for that. I promised Abigail that I'd have her running around on questions, and then I never actually invited those, so I apologize. But if there is a quick one.
A contemporary series that I took great interest in rewatching was Breaking Bad. And a lot of Lutherans were like, you're watching that craziness. And what I liked about it was the truth in how he saw this opportunity to provide for his family, wrongly doing so, and he was just going to do it that one time. And it's that taste of that apple.
Yeah.
And I just think that is a really accurate story of how we are as humans.
Yeah, and I actually spend, probably an hour or 2 hours with my students. One of the things we wrestle with is, at what point is the narrative maybe beyond where we want to be focused, that we're not focusing on that which is good and noble and true. And there are different ways, and I could maybe give you some resources to wrestle with that. I personally haven't watched that show. That's not to say there aren't other shows I've watched that maybe I'm like, Walking Dead. I thought I'd introduce my daughter to Happy Days a couple of years ago, and man, that show is not what I remember from my childhood. And so we wrestle with that, and what kind of the balance of shows that depict sin versus shows that promote sin, and how we wrestle with that. And to some degree, there's a bit of Christian conscience. I'm not trying to dismiss the sin aspect, but yeah, it's at least a conversation to have. And the reality is, who are we reaching out to? The people who are going to be maybe watching those shows. So we wrestle with that, and sometimes I get a chance to say, "Oh, tell me about that show." And I get enough that I can start asking questions and then do the same thing without having necessarily watched it myself. But absolutely. Okay, and we had another one.
I just wondered if you ever put art in this category.
Absolutely. But I don't, because I'm just not well versed, honestly. It's just not my repertoire. But yes, absolutely. Art fits here, music fits here. Literally, literature is just a form of art. It's just one category of art. So if we're talking graphic art, absolutely. Yes, sir.
I have more, not a question, but an observation based on from what you say, and literally apologetics based religion. So if you take the Bible and then open to your interpretation, you start having like Baptist and all these other religions that are forming, and so they're saying, yeah, we believe in the Bible, but we have a different perspective of what we see here. And so the same way for a story, the author or the screenwriter, they try to push you in a direction that they want you to see. The same way with the Bible, it's really to how your interpretation of how you see it. Now, with Lutheran, we believe word for what they say. But for other places, they say, well, yeah, God doesn't say anything. He's not really saying that gay people can't really have this religion. We can really be in it. So they take it and they twist it.
So let me suggest this, and this is what I was trying to get at with those two levels, is number one, I'm going to take a story for what it is. This is me being Lutheran. The text means what the text says. And I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. And there may be times when I'm encountering a story of some kind that I completely disagree with. But guess what? That still becomes an opportunity for a conversation. So I don't want to twist it and say, oh, it's always all about Jesus. No, sometimes it's very much against Jesus. Or just Jesus hasn't been given a thought in the story. But what I'm suggesting is taking the story at its own words, letting the story interpret itself, which is exactly what we do with Scripture. I can then say, hey, look, there's a reflection, there's an echo that's coming out of here into the human condition, and now that I'm picking up on that, let me carry you to the cross. So, yeah, that's good concern to have. So,
Well, big thank you to Pastor Cox for our presentation this afternoon.
Thank you.
Let's take about a 10-minute break, 12-minute break, and we'll be back for a final session at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.